In this module is called Semantic Relationships. We look at a variety of semantic relationships that any semantic theory must account for. Okay, so we'll look at a bunch of these things. The first and most basic semantic relationship is entailment. To see what entailment means, consider the following sets of sentences. So let's look at the following. Suppose I say this is red. I point to something and say this is red. And then I say this is a balloon. And then I say this is a red balloon. There is a sense in which the last sentence that I uttered, this is a red balloon, follows from the previous two sentences, namely that this thing is red and this thing is a balloon. Similarly, consider the following pair. Okay, suppose I say John cut the bread with a knife and compare that to John cut the bread. If the first statement is true, the second statement has to be true. In the previous three examples that we saw, I had three sentences. If any situation that you can imagine in which the first two sentences are true, the third sentence must also be true. So this is the most basic semantic relationship that any semantic theory must be able to account for. And this is the relationship of entailment. There is a way, essentially what we say is that a statement A entails a statement B by definition if and only if every circumstance or situation in which A is true, B is also true. Another way of expressing the same thing is to say that A and not B are contradictory. That means A and not B can never be simultaneously true. Another way of saying the same thing is to say that the information contained in B is the information conveyed by B is contained in the information conveyed by A. These are all equivalent ways of defining entailment, and this is something that's very basic, and that's something that any semantic theory must account for. Okay. Now, entailment patterns can arise from, they can have a variety of sources. So, in the first example, in the second example that we saw, John cut the bread with a knife, and you compared that with John cut the bread. The entailment pattern you can see is partly a consequence of the syntactic structure of the sentences that you saw. But sometimes entailment patterns could also be a result of your choice of certain lexical items. So consider the following example, and you can contrast this with the first example that I gave when I said this thing is red, this thing is a balloon. They jointly entail that this thing is a red balloon. Now compare this with the following three sentences. Suppose I point to something and say this is big, then I say this is an elephant, and then I say this is a big elephant. You will notice that there is a difference between the cases involving red and the case involving big, because in this example that I just gave you, the two sentences, this thing is big and this thing is an elephant, do not jointly entail that this is a big elephant. Okay? And this is because there is a basic difference between the meaning of an adjective like big and an adjective like red. So, for example, big is always evaluated with respect to some standard, unlike red, where something is red or it is not, whereas big is always something is big relative to some other things. Okay? So, in fact, when you say this is big, you basically mean something like this is a big thing. Now we know that elephants are huge creatures. In fact, baby elephants are in some sense big things. So just because I point to a baby elephant and say this thing is big, this thing is an elephant, it does not follow from these two statements that this thing is a big elephant. So the difference between this example and the example involving red, here we see that the entailment pattern doesn't hold because of certain lexical properties of the adjective big. Sometimes entailment patterns could simply be a consequence of the meaning of certain lexical items that you choose. So for example, suppose I say John is a bachelor, it entails that John is male, it also entails that John is married. This is a consequence of the fact that bachelor in some sense just means an unmarried male. Okay, so in this particular case, the entailment pattern is not a result of the syntactic structure and the meaning of certain lexical items, but purely a consequence of the meaning of the particular lexical items that we were considering. Okay. Now, related to the notion of entailment is another notion that's sometimes called logical equivalence. Sometimes it's also called content synonymy. Okay, so we say that a statement A is logically equivalent to B if and only if A and B entail each other. Okay, so if A entails B and B entails A, we say that they are logically equivalent. Now, what are examples of logically equivalent statements? So consider the following pair. Not every student came to the party, and compare that with some student didn't come to the party. Whenever any situation in which the first statement is true, the second statement must also be true. And any circumstance in which the second statement is true, the first statement must also be true. Okay? So essentially, the information conveyed by one is exactly the same as the information conveyed by the other statements. So statements like these are called content synonymous or logically equivalent. Similar relationship of logical equivalence can also be seen in statements like John saw Bill and Bill was seen by John. John saw Bill is an active sentence. Bill was seen by John is a passive counterpart of that statement. As it happens, they express the same content. Any circumstance in which the first statement is true, the second statement must also be true, and vice versa. So again, any semantic theory must give an account for why certain entailment patterns hold between different kinds of statement. Okay. Now, related to the notion of entailment is another semantic relationship that we frequently see in our whenever we make conversation in daily life. Okay, this is a related, but it's a weaker notion than entailment. It's sometimes called an implicator. What is the relationship of implicator? Work on implicators comes from the work of the philosopher H.B. Grice, who first noticed and formalized or made precise the notion. He basically observed the following. He basically showed that sometimes when we make conversation, we convey more than the literal meaning of the utterances that we make. Okay. So what kind of a relationship is implicator? So let's imagine the following conversation between two speakers. Speaker A says, "Did you enjoy the dinner last night?" The speaker B responds by saying, I had mushrooms and broccoli for dinner. Okay. All the speaker B hasn't directly answered the question about whether he or she enjoyed the dinner last night or not, but simply said what he or she ate. Now, if speaker A has prior knowledge of what kinds of things speaker B likes or hates, he might conclude either that speaker B enjoyed the dinner last night or didn't enjoy the dinner last night, depending on his or her prior knowledge of what B likes and hates. So he could either infer that B enjoyed the dinner, or he could infer that B didn't enjoy the dinner, depending on his prior knowledge. Okay. Now, this is a relationship, the relationship between what speaker B said and the inference that speaker B enjoyed the dinner or didn't enjoy the dinner is obviously not one of entailment. Okay. Because the information conveyed by one is not contained in the information contained by the other. However, in a certain circumstance, this may well be a reasonable inference. Okay. So implicature, these kinds of inference relationships were called implicatures by Grice, and that's the standard practice that linguists have since followed. What makes entailments different from implicatures? Now, one of the things Grice pointed out was that implicatures are crucially different from entailments in that they have two properties that distinguish them from, at least two properties that distinguish them from entailments. Implicatures are, number one, they are defeasible, and number two, they are reinforceable. Okay. They are defeasible in the sense that you can actually explicitly deny the inference by making a proper continuation. So, for example, suppose speaker B knows that speaker A in the previous conversation that I mentioned knows that speaker B hates mushrooms and broccoli. Okay. Nevertheless, it might so happen that for some reason, maybe because the mushrooms and broccoli were prepared in such a manner, or for whatever reason, speaker B in fact enjoyed it. Okay. The speaker B can defeat the inference that he or she didn't enjoy the dinner by simply saying, I ate mushrooms and broccoli for dinner last night, but you know what? I liked it. Okay. Now, here what you have done is you have explicitly denied the inference, and that is not viewed as odd in any way as a part of the conversation. Okay. Now, if you want to compare this way of defeating an inference to the case of entailment, consider the following sentence. Suppose I say, Kim kissed Lee passionately. That statement entails that Kim kissed Lee. Okay. But suppose you try to continue that by saying that Kim kissed Lee passionately, but Kim didn't kiss Lee. That clearly sounds contradictory, and if you utter this, if you continue your utterance of the statement Kim kissed Lee passionately by saying that but Kim didn't kiss Lee, it sounds strange and odd and obviously contradictory. This is very different from the case of implicature. Okay. Implicatures also have the property of being reinforceable. Okay, you can explicitly reinforce the inference by just repeating what you had previously said. So, for example, suppose again, let's go back to the previous conversation between speaker A and speaker B. speaker A knows that B hates mushrooms and broccoli, and so they clearly they can infer from a statement that speaker B had mushrooms and broccoli last night that they must have hated the dinner. Speaker B can actually reinforce this inference by saying, you know, I had mushrooms and broccoli for dinner last night, so obviously I hated the dinner. Okay, but try doing that when in a conversation that involves entailment rather than an implicator. So let's look at this case of Kim kissed Lee passionately and Kim kissed Lee again. Suppose I said Kim kissed Lee passionately, and then I continue that statement by saying and Kim kissed Lee. That sounds strange because it sounds very redundant, and it's not something that you would ever say in a proper conversation. Okay. Now, it sounds odd not because it's contradictory, but because it's felt to be redundant. Okay, as it happens in conversation, this is also felt to be very strange. You can say the same things, you can see the same things in certain other kinds of examples that give rise to implicators of various kinds. So suppose I said John used to smoke, and compare that with John doesn't smoke anymore. It is obvious that the first statement implies the second statement. Is this a case of entailment, or is it a case of implicator? Now try your tests again. Is it reinforceable? Is it defeasible? Let's continue John used to smoke by saying with something like, for all I know, John still does. So suppose I said, I know for sure that John used to smoke, and for all I know, he still does. Now this doesn't feel like it's contradictory, okay? And this shows that this inference is defeasible. Is it reinforceable? Let's say John used to smoke, but doesn't anymore, okay? So you try to reinforce the same inference, and again, that doesn't sound redundant at all. Okay, so this shows that the relationship between used to and does not anymore is in fact a relationship of implicator. It's not a case of entailment. Now, there is a slight difference between this class of cases and the class of cases that I had shown previously. The last example that I just gave is an example of what Grice called. Now, Grice distinguished between what he called particularized implicators and generalized implicators. Particularized implicators are implicators that come about in certain contexts because of the properties of specific kinds of contexts. So if you go back to the example involving a speaker A and the inference they made about whether someone enjoyed the dinner or not based on what they know, based on their prior knowledge about the likes and dislikes, is an example of what's called a particularized implicators, because the implicator actually depends on properties of certain specific situations. But the example with used to and not anymore is actually independent of the particular situation in which you utter. Anytime someone says that John used to smoke, and there is no explicit information to the contrary in your context, you will infer that John doesn't smoke anymore. One of Grice's claims about why implicators arise is because Grice claimed that implicators arise as a consequence of certain properties of the situation. This could involve background knowledge that speakers have about various things, but also what he called principles of rational conversation. For Grice, particularized implicators arise whenever there are some specific properties of a situation Combine them with your principles of rational conversation, the two together lead you to infer certain things. Generalized implicators, on the other hand, are implicators that arise purely as a consequence of your principles of rational conversation. So Grice actually had an account that said that there is a reason why used to, from my use of the word used to, you can infer not anymore. This was simply a consequence of certain principles that he said, that he claimed were underlie, whenever we make conversation, we basically say things, we don't say redundant things, we assume that you are being reasonable, you say as much as you know and no more, and so on. Okay, so the actual account is kind of complicated. We'll see this in some of the later chapters. I don't want to get into this at this point, but the only thing I wanted to point out is that the distinction between these two things forms the basis for an account of implicature relationships. Okay. Now there is a third relationship that's called the relationship of, it's called presupposition. This is again, it's another semantic relationship that's related to entailment and implicature, but is slightly different from what we said. What is a presupposition? Sometimes when we say something, we take some other things for granted. So suppose I say John has stopped smoking. Okay, compare that with John used to smoke, John doesn't smoke anymore. Okay, now clearly if you say John has stopped smoking, it entails John used to smoke. Okay, now compare that with John doesn't smoke anymore. This is also an entailment, because if I said John has stopped smoking, it clearly entails that John doesn't smoke anymore. However, there is a difference between the semantic relationship that holds between the first sentence and the second sentence, and the relationship between the first sentence and the third sentence that I just mentioned. So to see the difference, just put the word stop in a variety of environments. Now suppose, compare John has stopped smoking with John hasn't stopped smoking. Suppose I say, has John stopped smoking? Suppose I say, John may have stopped smoking. Suppose I say, if John has stopped smoking, he will recover from emphysema. Okay. Suppose I say, let's suppose that John has stopped smoking. Whenever I utter any of these things, the person I am talking to, the addressee, will most likely infer that John used to smoke. Okay. In other words, the relationship between John has stopped smoking and John used to smoke is not simply a relation. It does involve a relationship of entailment, but it's also a lot more than the relationship of entailment. Okay. In other words, anytime I put the word stop in a variety of these contexts, suppose I put it in negation, suppose I put it in a question, suppose I put it under a modal like may, suppose I put it in the antecedent of a conditional statement like an if-then statement, suppose I put it in a let's suppose that kind of context, the inference still holds. This is a property that we often call presupposition. Okay. Now compare John has stopped smoking with John doesn't smoke anymore. You will immediately notice that while there is clearly a relationship of entailment between the first statement and the third statement, it's not a relationship of presupposition, because you try putting them in all these various contexts, you will immediately notice that the relationship doesn't hold anymore. Okay, so suppose I said, is it true that John doesn't smoke anymore? Okay, that clearly does, if I ask you this question, clearly you cannot infer that John doesn't smoke anymore, whereas you will infer that John used to smoke at some past time. Okay? So in other words, whereas the first statement entails the third statement, it doesn't presuppose it. Okay? Presuppositions arise in various kinds of contexts. They are often triggered by specific lexical items like has stopped and so on. One common example of that you can think of in English where presuppositions arise is what's called a cleft construction. So suppose I said it is the butler who murdered Mr. Smith. Compare that with the butler murdered Mr. Smith and someone murdered Mr. Smith. Okay. Again, the first statement entails the second statement and the third statement. You will notice, however, that whereas the first statement presupposes the third statement, it merely entails the second statement. Okay. So if you want to do, put it in the relevant, put it in those contexts, put it under negation. It isn't the butler who murdered Mr. Smith. Is it the butler who murdered Mr. Smith? It is possible that it is the butler who murdered Mr. Smith. If it is the butler who murdered Mr. Smith, he must have left some trace. Let's suppose for a second that it is the butler who murdered Mr. Smith. None of these allow the inference that the butler murdered Mr. Smith, but they all allow the inference that someone murdered Mr. Smith. That means the statement, the butler murdered Mr. Smith, is not presupposed by the cleft construction. It is the butler who murdered Mr. Smith, but someone murdered Mr. Smith is entailed, but it's also presupposed by the cleft construction that I mentioned. Okay. Now, presuppositions give rise to various puzzles and interesting properties. So it has been noticed, for example, in the work of linguists like Kartunen, that presuppositions of utterances can be inherited in some complex expressions that contain them. Okay. This is what happens in the context that I just mentioned, negation, questions, and so on. But then there are also other complex expressions where presuppositions are just lost. So suppose I said someone murdered Mr. Smith and it was the butler who did it. Whereas the cleft construction, it was the butler who did it, who murdered Mr. Smith, in fact presupposes that someone murdered Mr. Smith. The conjunction of these two statements, someone murdered Smith and it was the butler who did it, does not presuppose that someone murdered Mr. Smith anymore. It merely entails it. Okay? So if you want to check, just put it in a question and say, is it the case that someone murdered Mr. Smith and it was the butler who did it? Okay. It's obvious that it's not a presupposition anymore.